My words today are about enmity and compassion. You probably know the word enmity means something like hate, being hostile with something, or being in opposition to something. So it seems like it's quite the opposite of words like empathy and compassion. But the antonym, the opposite word of empathy, is more along the lines of indifference. Enmity is not indifference, it's a very strong feeling, much stronger than indifference. And it reminds me of a few years ago, during my academic years, when I was involved in an interdisciplinary research project in which I actually studied empathy. I studied enmity, and I got funding for it. It was enmity in human relations. And I worked with somebody in political science, somebody in philosophy, somebody in religion, somebody in anthropology, and I was the one in sociology. So it was an interdisciplinary project. And we presented it at the annual conference of the American Anthropological Association. That's an association where typically there are 3,000 to 4,000 people present. I think only 5 came to our session. It was not, it was not very popular. The word didn't elicit much presence there. And I can see why that was, because it was an anthropological association. And we were essentially describing what used to happen when anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, used to go into the field, as they call it, to study the cultures of people that were very different from their own. And looking at some of the photographs that anthropologists took in the middle of the 20th century or even earlier, it showed a typical cultural anthropologist as someone who was a white male and often dressed all in white. In fact, some of the anthropologists that I used to see as colleagues also dressed in white. When they went into the jungle, I would not wear white if I go into the jungle, but they did. There was a reason for that. It was that distinction, that aura of whiteness. And then when they met a group, they would make contact with the male elders of what they saw as a tribe. If females were studied at all, that would be the task of the anthropologist's wife, who might also be on the journey. She would get to know some details about food preparation, childcare, and those other things in what was seen as the domestic female sphere. A title of one of the pieces we wrote was a little provocative. It was called "The Anthropologist and His Wife." No wonder no one came to our session. The anthropologist himself would elicit information from the males about rituals, religious practices, warfare, and other such important things. And what was especially interesting in these situations is that anthropologists truly believed that the things they were finding out in this gender-segregated approach really got to the innermost secrets of the group. Well, that was not necessarily the case. There were situations, as was realized later, where the group that was studied did not give away knowledge about the important goings-on. They would only parse out little, not so important things, or maybe even misleading things. And this was particularly the case when the more important elders were the women of the group. Nowadays, Such anthropological studies are done with much more awareness of cultural diversity and respect. It's totally different. People that are studied are asked to teach us. They are asked, what's important to you? Can you share some of that? They're given cameras. There's all kinds of things to lessen that divide. It's not perfect. Why do we feel we have to go into the field to begin with? Who comes into our white field and studies us and our rituals? Maybe there is an anthropologist in here somewhere in our room who's doing that, but I don't think so. But even in those earlier days, the visitors were treated with courtesy, with empathy and compassion. They were fed and housed with genuine hospitality, even though the actual relations were rather hostile or inimical. I remember an anthropologist rather recently telling me about how wonderful the hospitality was in this village they were visiting, and that they slaughtered their only chicken to welcome them. I thought that's a little problematic, but it's still happening, so things are not yet perfect. So I was keeping track of studies in which enmity was apparent, while at the same time empathy and compassion were also present. And that brings me closer to the present time. A time, rather recently, when a very well-known liberal sociologist by the name of Arlie Hochschild, have you ever heard of her? She's a very famous sociologist. And she went to the deep south in Louisiana to find out more about the reasons why mostly poor, white people, and people who were a little better off but not well off by any means, why they were such strong supporters of the so-called Tea Party, a subgroup of the Conservative Party. And her book is called Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. It was published in 2017, but it was 5 years in the making before that. And what she did, she is one of those sociologists who has a lot of courage going into the field. She went and interviewed about 60 people in Louisiana over a period of 5 years, from approximately 2011 to 2016. Those who were employed were working for corporations engaged in activities like oil refinery and others that were among the most polluting industries in the world. You probably know the names of some of those companies. They were located in Louisiana because environmental restrictions in Louisiana were the least stringent, helped by the fact that local decision makers were easily swayed to look the other way when it came to protecting the environment. Now, this is an environment of bayous, of swampland, of very fragile ecology and balance. But that's what we're dealing with. And some of those who were interviewed and their families already suffered from cancer. And yet they were supportive of the industries that had settled in this unique and fragile natural environment of bayous and indiscriminately polluted it. There's one person in particular that I remember from this book. He was told by his employer to go in the night with these containers. They were like those little railway containers, and he was supposed to get them out of the way from where the industry was operating, and he was supposed to roll them to the bayou and dump them there. And And that is what he did night after night. His clothing got rather damaged by the chemicals in the process. And one day he went to his supervisor and he said, you know, my clothes, look at them. I would like you to replace them, to give me money to replace them. And they said, okay, go and estimate how much damage there was. He went to the store, to Kmart or someplace like that, and checked how much it would cost to buy new jeans and a new top and all that. And he gave the estimate to his supervisor. And they looked at it, and they said, no, that's not correct. You gave us an estimate for new jeans. Your jeans were already used. We're going to give you $5. So that's the kind of situation we are dealing with. So you wonder, what caused this? What caused this loyalty to those kinds of companies? And gradually, Arlie Hochschild found that the worldview of the people she interviewed was deeply affected by two historical events: the defeat of the South in the Civil War in the 1860s, and the development of social programs, social welfare programs, around the 1960s and beyond. And they had come to see the federal government in Washington as a faraway entity, out of touch with them, not knowing about people in the Deep South. An entity that just imposed taxes for policies that benefited others. And by others, they meant people like people of color. They saw themselves, they visualized themselves as standing in a waiting line, so to speak, where there's a decent life at the end, in the front. But the social welfare programs from Washington kept placing them farther and farther back in that line. And when Obamacare was being considered, they saw this as yet another program that placed them farther back in the line. So they were against it. How good would it have been for them to be able to get universal health care to deal with their problems of cancer and other diseases? They did not make that connection. They didn't want to make that connection. It was an evil policy devised by people in Washington, D.C. So they developed more and more feelings of enmity, of hatred toward the people they saw being closer in the front of the line. The Tea Party organizers and the corporations that were active in the Deep South capitalized on those sentiments and reinforced them in their rhetoric. Tea does not just stand for the Boston Tea Party and the uprising against taxes that were imposed by a faraway government in the United Kingdom. No, yes, it meant that. But it specifically was an acronym for taxed enough already. That's what T stands for, DEA. And here were the corporations, the main employers in the region, whose spokespersons would say, "We hear you. We also feel we've been taxed enough already. We're on your side. We are your only hope." And this is how people came to support those who hurt them the most, and literally hated those whom they saw as cutting in front of them in the line to a better life. When I read an early version of Arlie Hochschild's book when it was about to be published, I just knew what the outcome of the 2016 election was going to be. There was no similar rhetoric on what you might call the other side. And since then, we have seen the Tea Party morph into something else. into the MAGA movement, with increasingly strongly worded expressions of enmity. Two new groups have come to join those who are viewed as responsible for getting further and further back in the line. Immigrants, presumably undocumented, and trans people. One takes the jobs that they couldn't get, and the other presumably uses federal funding for surgeries or whatever, or also to get jobs in DEI programs. Someone who has outstayed a visitor's visa may now be described as illegal and criminal and subject to a chilly ice visit and what follows thereafter. I personally know a story of someone who was working on a team as a mechanic for just a week or two and outstayed his visa, because his permit, because his flight back home was cancelled and he had to go the next day. So he got a call, said, "You have to leave the country, you're now here illegally." He said, "Well, yeah, I have a flight tomorrow." He got on that flight, and when he was trying to ask for a drink, the flight attendant said, "I'm sorry, we cannot give you a drink, you are being deported." And then he realized that the person next to him was a US federal marshal. So that's how bad it can get. And we see the actions and the continued rhetoric of hatred every single day in the news and around us. Those who see themselves as being prevented from reaching the front of the line have feelings and express those feelings in such strong ways that they have become what activist Fran Lebowitz, whom you may know, has called people who love their hate more than they love their lives. I need not describe what this all led to. We're living it every day. But nowadays, there are movements that are more on the side of empathy and compassion and that elicit a worldview that is consistent with that. I'm thinking about the peaceful demonstrations, for example, of the Black Lives Matter movement. And as we saw yesterday, the No Kings movement. Yesterday saw protests in about 2,700 cities, with a total number of participants, at least 7 million. Quite a bit more than the 5 million of the previous No Kings Day. So this is a rising movement. It is not the biggest movement ever. There were anti-war movements that, for example, that have taken place over long periods of time that overall gathered more participants. But this is huge. And now I want to go back for a moment to Arlie Hochschild and her interviews of the Tea Party members in the Deep South. Throughout her multiple visits, it was quite obvious to the people she interviewed that she was in a very different group, ideologically speaking, than the people she interviewed. She was part of the establishment they hated vividly. They did not hate the companies they worked for. Those they viewed with empathy. Those companies, they were doing the best they could under the circumstances with all those taxes. But Arlie Hochschild was a liberal sociologist teaching at what is known as maybe the most liberal university in the country, Berkeley University. And they knew that. And yet she was treated with courtesy, with empathy, with compassion. She received that famous Southern hospitality. It's not a myth, it really exists. Southern hospitality filled with conversations over homemade pies, tea, maybe stronger drinks, and kindness. kindness. And this underlying kindness fills me with hope. Kindness is not just present in people who participate in the No Kings protests, and not just in Unitarian Universalists who adhere to their basic principles and values. It is somewhere in all of us. For some who presently love their hate more than they love their own life, it is deeper down. But we may hope that it is not gone forever. And may we keep expressing courageous compassion, the fierce sort of compassion, and kindness and hope